Welcome back to the Growth Without Referrals, the podcast where leaders talk honestly about what's actually winning to win new clients today, beyond referrals. I'm Mark Ferguson, and today I'm joined by Rob Galbraith, the founder of Forestview Insights, innovation advisor, speaker, and author of The End of Insurance as We Know It. And Rob, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Mark.
Great. And you spent 25 years inside insurance, 20 years at USAA, then wrote a book that became well known in the industry, and eventually you made the leap and launched Forestview Insights. For people who don't know your background, could you give us a short version of that journey?
Sure, happy to. So I was always interested in business and finance. I got my major in economics at Michigan State University. Go Green! Gotta give them a shout out. And my first job was supporting economists at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., which was an amazing job. And then after a couple of years there, I moved to San Antonio, Texas. Wanted to be in the warm weather after growing up in snowy Michigan. And I was fortunate enough to catch on with USAA and spent a couple of years as an analyst in a couple of different roles that were not to insurance, but I was always interested in what the CEO would say at quarterly meetings, and wanted to know, like, how's this company make money? I don't really understand, like, how this P&C business works. And so had a great boss at the time that recommended I start my journey towards the Chartered Property Casualty professional certification, or CBCU designation. Did that, found it fascinating, and was fortunate to catch on as a pricing analyst. And you really kind of get the guts of how the insurance works when you're working essentially as an actuary. I tried my hand at the actuarial exams. Unfortunately, my math was not that good, so I did not succeed at that. But I was very fortunate in the mid-2000s to be offered the opportunity to join the underwriting team, where ultimately I spent 15 of 20 years. And they were standing up an advanced analytics department. And they said, your skill set is perfect, and you don't have to pass any of those actuarial exams. You can come in, use your data and analysis skills to help us. And it ended up being fantastic because we were able to look at what I would say is conventional wisdom, right, that had been passed down kind of from generations, from underwriter to underwriter to underwriter, in a new light, to say, do these rules, these regulations, these guidelines that we have make sense or not? And I always appreciate that way of coming at the business, because I didn't start as a junior underwriter, from the ground up, looking at individual accounts and work my way up the way a lot of traditional folks do. And I think that's important, just because I think it led to having a curious mindset and an innovative mindset, and not necessarily having any preconceived notions on how the business should work. I was fortunate enough to do well in that job, and later on was offered the opportunity to take a leadership position in a couple different roles. And so I got to get a firmer base in insurance through that. And we were also lucky that we had a CEO at the time that really was emphasizing innovation. Coming out of the great financial crisis, the USA was fortunately in a very strong financial position relative to many of its competitors. And so he really wanted to push the pedal on growth, and also through innovation. And so for about 10 years, that was the mantra from high. And so it was a message, I think, that really resonated with me. And we started looking at new ways of doing things and really experimenting. And this was around the time that a lot of financial or technology was going to the financial services industry. Again, coming out of the banking and financial crisis, I don't think there was any coincidence that Bitcoin was developed in 2009 coming out of that. So fintech, as it was kind of known, had this smaller brother or sister called insurtech. And so in the mid 2010s, it really took off. And so it was the very first time, I was being exposed to Silicon Valley and a lot of startups and new technology. And it really just got my ideas going, got my motor going, and ultimately was so excited by some of the things that I was seeing and were developing in the industry that, as you mentioned, I spent all of 2018, when I wasn't kind of in my day job, writing down some thoughts that ultimately became a book called The End of Insurance as We Know It, and released that in 2019. And that's really where my career took a different turn. Rather than continuing to go up the corporate ladder, made the decision to leave USA to go on a book tour. And then I was fortunate enough after that to catch on as a director of innovation at a mid-sized insurance firm called AF Group. And I led their innovation function for 2.5 years. I had, unfortunately, in that role, kind of two different hats. I had my corporate hat on still, but I had this kind of author speaker hat. And what I didn't appreciate at the time that I later came to appreciate was when I released the book and went on the book tour. In some ways, I was starting my own business at that time. I just didn't recognize it. So it took about 3 years to kind of say, you know what, I think this has gone beyond what I thought it could be. I was kind of hoping, I think someone told me the average book sells about 200 copies. And so that was my initial goal. And when we got to the several thousands, I kind of stopped keeping track and realized, this thing is resonating with folks, which of course is great as an author, but obviously opened more doors than I could have ever imagined.
Amazing. A very fascinating story. And you're not running a massive consulting firm with 200 people. This is a boutique advisory business. And so when you think about growth for Forestview Insights, what does growth actually mean to you?
So for me, it's really the right kind of growth. And I've really spent the last 3 years thinking about what that looks like, Mark. Originally, and I think like any small business, it evolves over time. What I've recognized through, working with a lot of startups myself in the corporate world and now being in that space, most startups, I think, recognize a problem, a real need, that they've diagnosed it. I don't know that one startup that I've ever met that said, we aim to solve this problem. And I don't think I've ever thought, well, is that really an issue? I think that works just fine the way it is. But I think the challenge becomes, right, what is the solution set? Like okay. So to me, there's a reason there's kind of an intractable problem or something that, hasn't been fully solved. And that's because it's hard, it's difficult. And if the solution was easy, somebody would have already come up with that. And so when I started, I think was focused on content. I felt like as an innovation leader, there wasn't a lot of information out there that was unbiased about some of these new technologies. Like, where would I come to learn? There weren't any books, right? Because it was so cutting edge. I can't just go to maybe traditional media, traditional books. A lot of them, the press articles were basically regurgitated press releases. And so frankly, the most important source of information was from many of the vendors themselves. So you're teaching me about AI, for instance, on the one hand, but at the same time, you're also trying to sell me something. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way at all, but it just always made me very uncomfortable. As Paul Harvey say, what's the rest of the story, right? What am I not knowing? And maybe the way that you view this technology has led you to make a certain amount of choices that other companies have made different choices. And it'd be good to kind of know what that is and what the pros and cons of it and make a more intelligent decision, both when I was in the corporate seat, right, to make some of those purchasing decisions or advising, and now in the consulting role. So I think when I originally started Forestview, the idea was, hey, publish a newsletter, right? Start a podcast, like get this information out there. And then have some type of freemium model where it's like, okay, I'm giving value to everybody through the free part, but then for those that want to go deeper, they can kind of get into the premium part. My initial thought was that scales, right? Because I could have 10 subscribers or 100 subscribers or 1,000 or 10,000. And it could be the same effort on my part, but yet, as the subscriber growth grows, then that scales. But as you know, probably working on this podcast and through some of your other efforts, right? Obviously, we're all drowning in content. There's a lot of great information out there, and there's an overwhelming amount of information out there. And then getting people to find you, is challenging, and then get people to pay for it, of course, and to give them something worth paying for is challenging. And so that's where I kind of pivoted towards the consulting and advisory business, where I still, develop some content. We'll talk more about that, but it is kind of will let me really dive deep into helping people with the issues that they've got with kind of my unique background and tool set, where I can really add the most value rather than putting some stuff out there, giving some free stuff, some stuff, charging them, but not really necessarily knowing, is this really adding value to you, and how much value, and what would you be willing to pay?
Okay. All right. Rob, thank you. And this podcast is called Growth Without Referrals. And most consulting firms I talk to are heavily dependent upon referrals. So I'm curious, how much of your business currently comes from referrals versus something more proactive?
Yeah, it's probably about half and half. And
Okay.
you're right. I think, through the release of the book tour, some of the industry contacts that I already had, that definitely was a great starting point for launching a business. But as you know, as you grow at a certain point, you tap out kind of your primary contacts and then secondary contacts. all of a sudden, when you try to sell those Girl Scout cookies, it could be challenging over time. And then once you get beyond that, I've experimented with a lot of different strategies on marketing, social media, and others, and I found that to be very challenging. So going beyond your initial referrals and then trying to broaden out your base, but not trying to cast a wide net in an inefficient manner, I think is very difficult, because again, there's so many folks that do have the ad dollars that can deluge everybody, that having people find you. I think maybe in the early days of Google, the AdWords and stuff like that, that probably was a good value. But I think, these days, right, it's been bid up to where it is still very challenging.
True. And I see your book and you're speaking. Those two things I think are excellent, with getting your name out there, getting in front of people, talking about your philosophies and your business. So I would think that would help. Absolutely. But what's the hardest part about growing a thought leadership driven consulting business?
Yeah. So I think it's going from getting folks to know a little bit about you, who you are, what you're passionate about, where your expertise lies, into then converting that into a sale. And particularly where I think some of the challenge in the past was people would say, well, what type of consulting do you do? I'd kind of say, well, I can do whatever you want me to do. And I can do this and this, and everything is really bespoke. And there's some truth to that, but it also made it hard to convert, if that makes sense. Right? It was kind of like, well, I'm here. Here's my number. Here's my email. Here's how you can reach out to me if you ever have a need for me. And a couple folks, a few folks found me that way, but it's not much of a sales pitch, as you might imagine. And so then I really started kind of narrowing down to like, here the area, if you're having problems in this universe, and really culling that down to I really have kind of focused on, if your challenge is to build a lasting culture of innovation. Well, what does that mean? I said, well, that usually means going beyond a visionary leader or a particular technology and whatnot, to where, a lot of companies really struggle with that. They're trying to innovate, but a lot of stuff dies on the vine, or they get halfway there. People get frustrated. The change management's obviously a huge part of it, right? Getting everybody on board and kind of to embrace change is really challenging. So there's a lot of different elements to it, and there are best practices that have been kind of identified, but they haven't been codified, haven't been widespread. It's not like the stone tablets that come down and we all know kind of what those are now. And so that's a big part of what I do. And when I frame it that way and I start talking to people about challenges that might be having innovation, that could be companies that have had some success in the past, but they're looking to extend it, or that could be some that are really struggling to move on. And honestly, Mark, sometimes it relates to talent. We got a lot of waiver retirements, and we're trying to appeal to younger folks, and they don't see us as innovative. And so, saying, hey, we match Ks or whatever, doesn't have the same appeal that it used to. So I think I kind of pivot towards, here's the things that I can do. And then within that space, now let's talk about what your needs are. I think that's really helped, if that makes sense, rather than just trying to be all things to all people.
Yes. What's something that you've tried for growth that didn't work out the way you expected?
I kind of alluded to it before, but I think spending money on advertising, and particularly social media advertising, what's nice about it is that you can get access to some of the stats in a way that maybe some other advertising spending, it's more difficult to know, is that resonating with people or not? And obviously having kind of a small budget kind of limits, right, just the mediums that it can do. But the downside is the conversion rate isn't great. And then even within that, the types of folks that are driven, it's pretty widespread, and it's not targeted. And so that's really, I think, the biggest challenge. And I've tried at different platforms. This isn't, this is somewhat agnostic across platforms. I think some worked a little better than others, but ultimately none of them looking to drive the type of business leads really that I was looking for. The other thing too, I'll mention, Mark, is, and this can be a double-edged sword, I think, conferences. So I've spoken at a lot of conferences, and some are really valued, but over time, I've really, I think, sussed out, or you can spend a lot of money flying all over the country and all over the world, right, attending different events. And, sometimes you feel like you get that opportunity to be a panelist on a third stage or whatnot. I should take this up and I'm going to network, I'm going to meet folks. But I've kind of learned like you can really blow through a budget, even if it's a travel budget rather than an ad budget or whatnot that way. And so just being a lot more selective about who's the audience, what's the size of the event. I'm probably going to get drowned out in a 10,000 person's conference, but if it's 200 people, like that's perfect because now when we're networking, it breaks. There's actual interactions rather than a bunch of people trying to walk by the expo booths to get the free food and then, sell back out. I think just being a lot more selective about, what are the right audience or what's a more targeted, cultivated, I guess, group of folks. And so those could be meetups that are local. Those could be, industry events. Those could be local, again, groups or whatnot. I think for each individual, it's going to be in each company, it's going to be a little bit different. I think just curating is the word that I would use, right? Just making sure that you have a good curated audience rather than trying to, there's been times where every week, right, I was on a plane somewhere else and you run yourself ragged, you run down your pocketbook and you kind of realize at the end of the day, well, how many genuine leads did I get out of that? Little to none.
Right. And Rob, we had talked a little bit about it, and I'm going to touch back on it, is this concept of content as a growth engine. You have a best-selling book, speaking engagements, you have your co-host on that InsurTech Geek podcast, industry presence. Those are things that have really built credibility, right, for you. And let me ask you this. Does content generate clients directly, or does it just shorten the sales cycle?
I think more of the latter. It can, I've definitely had people reach out, but I think it tends to be more passive in the background. Like I'm always surprised when I put a piece of content out there that you might see, well, how many people commented or how many people liked it. But then when I would travel and I would talk, people say, well, I saw this, right? Or I cannot tell you how many people bark. It's kind of funny. I've even said, I've heard of your book, then they'll like feel like they need to confess, but I haven't bought it or I haven't read it, or it's sitting on the shelf or whatnot. You joke with it like it's okay. There's an audiobook out there too you can check out. But so I think one thing I didn't realize initially was that as you are putting quality content out there, that it may be resonating beyond any metric, right, that you can capture, and is positioning yourself, I think, as an authority, as an expert in the spaces that you truly are. And I think people, pure marketing, right, versus actually helpful, useful content. And so trying to provide quality, and it can still be marketing, right? But it's content marketing, but as long as it's quality content, I think people resonate with that, and they're attracted to that. I just think sometimes there is that leap where it's like when you're talking about these problems, like I actually have that problem, right? And so sometimes that's the leap that you're trying to overcome, is to recognize like you've actually got an issue there. I can help you with that. Like let's make that connection. And so to your point, like I think once that connection is made, it's an easier sell on why I should be the one to help you fix that, because of the reputation and the expertise that you've built up through the content. But it usually isn't a direct one-for-one. Hey, you were talking in this last podcast about this. I figured you might be able to help me with that. It's rarely that. There is that bridge that I think is the most difficult part to overcome, to help people make that connection. Like I wasn't just talking in the abstract, like you've got a real problem, I've got real solutions. Let's talk about how we can help each other.
And you talk about innovation as a discipline, right? Something companies need structure around. And I'm curious, do you see growth itself as a discipline? And do most consultants treat it that way?
So, yes, I do. And I would say probably not as robustly as they should in terms of the consulting, the growth. And I think, again, we live in such a metrics area that it's easy to kind of, whatever your needs, however you measure those types of things and the impact that you're having, like, and I'm not saying those things aren't important. We all know about the sales funnel and having some line of sight into how people are coming into your funnel, where they are at various stages of the funnel, adapting that to, your organization and what that means to you, I think is important. But at the same time, I think the quality aspect, some of the qualitative aspects of that are right, difficult to necessarily measure or capture, but are really so important. And I do think very much too, Mark, of like, kind of the J curve, right? And that starting point. And again, like earlier on, right, you're just like, I got to tell everybody about Forestview, so I'm going to go anywhere and I'm going to talk to anyone. Over time, the good news is people start reaching out, you start getting clients, but then the bad news is now I've got these obligations, and I've been in moments where it's like I can't handle anymore because I'm tapped out with handling the existing folks, right? And there's been times where you're like, but I still need to be out marketing. Every hour I'm spending working on a project is an hour I'm not out there shouting from the rooftops, like, hey, here's Forestview, here's what we do. And so I think finding that balance, right, of people aren't going to find you. Maybe if you're big enough, right? They will, but for most folks, it's like, no, they're not going to find you. So you've always kind of got to be in that mode, but at the same time, you want to balance it to where you are kind of in your life cycle and be very intentional about the stages of growth. And I think the important part too, Mark, is you always have to deliver, right? And so I think for those early
Yes.
clients, of course, you're going to do your
Yes.
best, but then as you add more and more clients, you become more and more successful. The quality of your work, and whether that's you personally doing it, whether that's a team that you're bringing on, or you've got folks that you're contracting for various parts of it, or however you're managing that, that quality can't slip, and so that I think is the hardest part to getting to that scale. And at a certain point, right, you do grow in your maturity to where you've got everything going, but getting from A to B to C is that sustained kind of growth model where you can start to scale, you can take on, and now it becomes a lot more repeatable. I think is the A to B is hard, but I think B to C is even harder. Going from nothing, your first client, to a handful of clients to sustain you, that's one. But I think getting from that initial to where it's going beyond you individually, where you've got to scale up, is even harder in some ways.
And that's a great point. Thanks, Rob, for that perspective. And when it comes to other consultants, what do you see? What do you think? What are they doing wrong when it comes to growth?
I think right, looking for it in the wrong places, not necessarily being, and again, to that A to B, that those tend to be those referrals, that you kind of talked about, right? That initial growth through B to C. Okay, you're going beyond your initial let of contacts and they're, one off. Now you get to the 6 degrees type conversation. And so I think you can get spread too thin, really chasing any lead or trying to get a bunch of names on the spreadsheet, or however, folks are doing it, right, for cold outreach and things like that. So I think that's a mistake. And then the other thing is trying to be, everything to everybody. So you meet somebody, they express an interest, but is there truly a match? Are you going to shine? Are you going to do a good job for this prospective client or not? And if you take a job just because you're looking to take something on, right? And I get it, right? You don't want to say, you don't want to be hard to do business with. I keep saying that. I often find myself where sometimes I'm hard to do business with, and so that's a question I'm constantly asking. What are those sticking points for folks that either are doing business with me or want to do business with me? How can I break those down? But at the same time, sometimes you need some of those barriers in order to make sure that you're open to things you want to be open to, right? We all have those stories of the difficult customers, and you probably heard about people, well, you should fire some of your customers, your worst 10% or whatnot. And so I think those are the mistakes I see the most. It's like you're trying to grow, you're trying to reach out, but you're maybe pursuing growth at the expense of, you're devoting so much energy, so much resources towards pursuing growth. I don't know, say at all costs, but right to where you're not finding that right balance of what's the sweet spot for us and how can we do it organically. And that doesn't mean you don't go into new spaces. I think you absolutely want to do that, but I'm very much big into the kind of adjacent possible, where that natural extension maybe of what your initial core value proposition is, rather than really trying to go pretty far afield. I think those are the ones that now I'm trying to be all things to all people with my consultancy, and I'm probably not going to do a great job.
Okay. Well, Rob, let's talk about what's next, right? In our previous conversation, you mentioned writing a second book is a bucket list item, right? And if we fast forward 3 to 5 years, what does Forestview Insights look like?
Yeah, so I definitely have. It's funny, when I first started out, everything was truly bespoke. Every client I was kind of creating stuff from scratch. And over time, you handle enough that some of the stuff is a little bit on repeat, right? And everything is still customized, but it's not necessarily bespoke. Like I'm pulling from the same slides and maybe I'm putting, new twist on it or incorporating new things. But they're almost like always core elements of me and Forestview that go into each client engagement, which is nice because that gives you some repeatability and it also gives you some firm identity outside each individual client project that you might be working on. And what I've realized, Mark, and I a lot of those end up in my speeches when I do keynotes and other things like that. But I think I could easily write a second book, and now I think for a time there was always, well, do I have enough material or not? And ironically, by writing the first one, when you think about writing a second one, you know how much time and effort went into the first one, and it's almost intimidating, right, to do the second one. But there's definitely enough there, and I think my biggest hurdle really is convincing people that because I think a lot of people like, well, we have innovation efforts and we have innovation teams. Like, oh, there's a lot of companies out there that don't spend time thinking about innovation, but are they doing it the right way for their organization, for their industry, et cetera? And so I don't want to say that I've made up a problem because I've identified a problem through my 25 years in the industry and working with different organizations where I can say this is definitively an issue. But I think convincing folks that they have this issue and that I can help them is probably the biggest challenge. And that's where I think writing a book, doing more podcasts like that's the part where helping people understand that they have it and how we can help each other and that they will definitely be better off. It's the hardest part. And one of the two other things, Mark, is, when we're talking about innovation, I talk about the concept of new versus novel. So, sometimes people buy new technology, new software, and you can easily calculate a return on investment, right? Well, hey, if I get this new thing that's going to help me in this way. Usually when you're talking about something innovative, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of questions. And so what you want to do is you want to de-risk it, right? You want to spend a little bit of money, a little bit of time, invest a little bit of resources without going full scale. And I've seen these projects where it's like, okay, we just spent $60 million in 5 years and we have nothing to show for it. We could have just thrown that money in the pit today and saved ourselves the time, right? And saved everybody the heartache. And so those are the things I want to help organizations avoid, but usually you can't calculate an ROI or a meaningful ROI, right? Like if you change a few assumptions, the numbers all get out of whack. And so it's the same thing with trying to convince people, like you need to create a lasting culture of innovation. Innovation isn't just the flavor of the month. It's not the first thing you get rid of when a crisis hits, like I saw a lot of organizations do during the early days of the pandemic, where no, you should be actually leaning on it more rather than having that be the first cut because we think this is unnecessary now when we need to conserve resources. Not having that easy to calculate, ROI, or can show you, well, in 10 years, you're going to have this benefit from this interactions, this consultancy that we have. I think that's the hardest thing. But, that's where a lot of the content marketing, like once people start resonating with some of the concepts, some of the content, and it makes sense to them and they can have a chance to kind of absorb it and reflect on it, that's where usually now that bridge that I talked about earlier, where it's like, okay, now we both identified that we think there's an opportunity to help each other out here.
Okay, excellent, Rob. Here's a quick question. What's one thing you would tell someone leaving corporate to start advisory work?
I would say have a plan, but don't be afraid to do when opportunities arise. And I say that just because I think it is a big shock, and I know people can prepare themselves, and they're like, I left USAA, after a bonus, so I could kind of plan. Well, I think the bonus is going to be this, and that's going to last me this long, et cetera, right? So I think you can map those types of things out in terms of resources and how you're going to launch. I do think that's very important to but it's not something you want to do, obviously, spur the moment. Although some people don't have that opportunity, maybe there's a layoff or something unexpected that happens, and this is the pivot that you decide on. So we don't always have that, but at the same time, whatever you had in mind to start as your plan, it's usually never going to go exactly according to plan. And I think the hardest thing is when new things come in that you hadn't considered as possibilities. Okay, when do I deviate, or when do I kind of cut that avenue off because it would take me too far afield of what my initial vision was? I think those are the hardest things. So I think, whatever you can have is kind of if you have like just some checks, balances, questions, even really that you kind of run through. And again, not going to give anybody the answers, but I think having the vetting of an opportunity rather than just jumping on it, and you could find out that you end up in a very different place. And that could be a good thing, but that could also be a bad thing. And I know sometimes I come back to that for Forestview of, have I strayed too far from my initial vision, right? And so to your point about the content, it's like, am I putting enough content out there? I'm not doing a pay for the content part, right? I've decided on the free content and that to be more content marketing, and I think there's value there. But is that still a model that makes sense or not? And I think it does, but how much, what formats, what topics, et cetera. Like those are things I'm always kind of revisiting. I did a newsletter for about 2 years, and I had fun writing it. I was going to do 3 times a week. Then I realized that was a big commitment. I'd do 2 times a week. But now, I've stopped doing it for a couple of years. But the good news is, that content, it's still kind of evergreen. Thankfully, it wasn't kind of, based on whatever the latest in the news cycle was. And it populates my website, and I still get, questions and interest based on that. But those are the types of things like, okay, do I want to commit to doing this? And is this making enough of an impact? And should I continue that content path or pursue others? I think those are it's not necessarily right or wrong answers, but having some basis to make some of those decisions as you start out, I think is the most important thing, and not be afraid to adjust as you wander through your way and hopefully find success.
Great wisdom. So, Rob, this has been fantastic. For anyone listening who wants to connect with you, where should they go?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is a great place. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn. Happy to connect. Happy to engage over DM. I have a couple of emails. The best one to find me is rob@endofinsurance.com. And I've got confusion because I don't have the Forestview email, but I started the endofinsurances.com when I started the book. And so that's just kind of the email I've been using for a longer period of time. So that's a good way to find me as well.
Okay. And thanks for being transparent about what's working, what's still evolving. That's what this show's all about. And to everyone listening, if you're building a consultancy or advisory firm and you're trying to grow beyond referrals, keep leaning into systems, visibility, and discipline. And I'll see you next time on Growth Without Referrals. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Mark. Great chatting with you. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.